USS Monaghan was the last ship built of the Farragut-class destroyer design. She was named for Ensign John R.Monaghan. Monaghan was laid down on November 21, 1933 at the Boston Navy Yard, and launched on January 9, 1935. She was sponsored by Miss Mary F. Monaghan, niece of Ensign Monaghan, and commissioned on 19 April 1935, with Commander R. Thompson in command. During the next few years, Monaghan operated primarily in the North Atlantic, training U.S. Navy personnel who served in World War II. Monaghan was present during the Pearl Harbor raid on December 7, 1941. She participated in the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in 1942. Monaghan was sunk in a typhoon east of the Philippines in 1944. Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Monaghan was a ready-duty destroyer in Pearl Harbor, and at 7:51 was ordered to join Ward, who had just sunk an unidentified submarine off the entrance to Pearl Harbor an hour earlier. 4 minutes later, before Monaghan could get underway, the Japanese air attack began. Monaghan opened fire, and at 8:27 was underway to join Ward when notified of the presence of a Farragut-class midget submarine in the harbor. Monaghan headed for the trespasser, and the captain giving the order to ram. The submarine turned and fired its torpedo at the Monaghan. It missed, passing within 50 yards of the destroyer's starboard side. The Monaghan rammed the submarine glancingly, then sank it with 2 depth charges. Because of the shallowness of the harbor, when the depth charges detonated, the explosions lifted the Monaghan's stern out of the water. The destroyer then went out of control and smashed into a barge. She headed on out of the harbor to patrol offshore for the next week, then joined Lexington in the attempt to relieve Wake Island. But Wake was captured by the Japanese before Lexington's force could bring aid. Homeward bound, Monaghan, with Dale and Elwyn, made repeated attacks on an enemy submarine, causing it to broach and give off a large oil slick. Patrol and scouting operations out of Pearl Harbor with the Lexington group were followed by convoy duty to the West Coast and back before task Force 11, with Monaghan screening Lexington, sortied from Pearl Harbor on April 15, 1942, bound for the South Pacific, with the Japanese threatening Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Sea lines of communication to Australia and New Zealand were in peril, and the Navy moved quickly and decisively to block so critical a threat. First action came the 4th of May when planes from Yorktown hit Japanese invasion shipping at Tulungi and Gavutu. The two carrier forces now combined upon word that an enemy carrier group had entered the Coral Sea. The opening action of the victory that came the 7th of May, when American search planes spotted the Japanese occupation force. Several transports guarded by the light carrier Shoho. Lexington and Yorktown planes sank Shoho. Next day, before the major engagement by aircraft from both American and Japanese heavy carriers, Monaghan was ordered away from formation to transmit important messages, thus preserving radio silence in the main body. She was then ordered on to search for survivors of Neosho and Sims, sunk on the 7th by the Japanese. Since the position of the sinking had been erroneously reported, Monaghan was unable to carry out a rescue, and sailed on with messages for Noumea before rejoining TF-16 in time to return to Pearl Harbor the 26th of May. Battle of Midway. 2 days later, Monaghan was underway for the decisive battle of the war, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese sailed for the capture of the Midway Atoll with a complex battle plan, but U.S. naval intelligence revealed the plan to American commanders, who thus knew when and where to find the carrier striking task force of the Japanese attackers. Although outnumbered, the Americans sank 4 enemy carriers in air actions beginning on the night of the 3rd of June, along with a heavy cruiser. Through the first 2 days, Monaghan screened Enterprise. Then late on the morning of the 5th of June was ordered out to rescue men of a downed seaplane. At 18:30 she reached the side of badly damaged Yorktown, joining the group of destroyers struggling to save the carrier and guard her from further damage. A Japanese submarine penetrated next day and sank both Yorktown and Hammond, the carrier remaining afloat another 16 hours before she succumbed. Monaghan, Gwyn, and Hughes attacked and badly damaged the submarine. Other Pacific operations. After the victory, the force returned to Pearl Harbor on the 13th of June. Monaghan was sent north to aid in countering the Japanese threat in the Aleutians. Damaged by collision in the heavy northern fog, Monaghan repaired at Dutch Harbor and Pearl Harbor, then escorted a convoy to the west coast en route to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard at Vallejo, CA for a repair period. Monaghan returned to the South Pacific at Nandi, Fiji, the 17th of November. In the harbor of New Maya she bent her propellers on an underwater obstruction, and had to return to Pearl Harbor on her hastily replaced port screw for permanent repairs, completed the 21st of February 1943. Once more in the Aleutians, Monaghan joined TG-16.69, a scouting force built around cruisers Richmond and Salt Lake City. On the 26th of March this group engaged the Japanese in the Battle of the Komandorski Islands. Although outnumbered, the Americans fired guns and torpedoes so effectively that the Japanese were driven away. Patrol and occasional shore bombardment missions throughout the Aleutians, along with escort-in missions, continued through the summer. Highlights were a radar-directed surface engagement with an unidentified target the 20th of June, and a chase of a Japanese submarine 2 days later that resulted with the submarine being driven up on rocks and abandoned. She was later identified as Japanese submarine I-7, engaged in evacuating troops from Kiska. After escort duty to Pearl Harbor and San Francisco, Monaghan sailed to San Pedro, California, to escort 3 new escort carriers to the Gilbert Islands operation, for which they sailed from Espiritu Santo the 13th of November. The escort carriers launched the planes against shore targets and protected convoys offshore through the invasion of Tarawa. Returning to the west coast on escort duty, Monaghan rejoined the escort carriers after extensive exercises out of San Diego, California, and prepared for the invasion of the Marshalls, during which she guarded the carriers northwest of War as they flew air support and strikes for the landings there. On the 7th of February 1944 she entered Majuro, then escorted Pennsylvania to Kwajalein, where she joined the transport screen for the capture of Eniwetok. On the night of 22 February, she joined in an all-night bombardment on Parry Island, then spent a month on patrol and escort duty in the Marshalls. On the 22nd of March Monaghan put to sea in the anti-submarine screen for the fast carriers, bound for strikes on Palau, Woolai, and Yap, returning to Majuro the 6th of April. The next sortie, the 13th of April to the 4th of May, was to cover the Hollandia landings, and strike at Satawan, Truk, and Ponape. After preparing at Majuro, the force now sailed for the invasion of Saipan, against which the first strikes were flown the 11th of June, while the flyers of TF-58 soundly defeated the Japanese in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Monaghan's group patrolled off Saipan guarding against a possible breakthrough by the enemy. They next steamed to Eniwetok to prepare for the assault on Guam, for which they sailed the 14th of July. Monaghan again in the anti-submarine screen protecting the carriers, assigned to cover the work of underwater demolition teams off Agate on the night of 17-18 July. Monaghan furnished harassing fire until daylight, firing again on the island during the early morning of the 19th of June. She continued bombardment and screening missions until the 25th of July, when she sailed for Pearl Harbor and an overhaul at Puget Sound. Loss in a typhoon. After training off California and Hawaii, Monaghan sailed for Ulithi the 11th of November, though she joined the escort for 3 fleet oilers bound for a rendezvous the 17th of December with TF-38, whose planes had been striking Central Luzon in support of the Mindoro invasion. The ship was expecting to refuel and probably had reduced its ballast in order to take on fuel. Typhoon Cobra hit before the Monaghan was ready to ride it out. Typhoon Cobra claimed 790 lives in the 3rd Fleet, and sank Spence, Hull, and Monaghan. 6 men survived the Monaghan sinking, reportedly rescued by Brown and Ortabra. After drifting on a raft 3 days, the men reported that Monaghan took roll after roll to starboard, finally going over. The Typhoon Cobra tragedy, Admiral Chester Nimitz said, represented a more crippling blow to the 3rd Fleet than it might be expected to suffer in anything less than a major action. Monaghan received 12 battle stars for World War II service.